Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristy Morley, and I am the Senior Naturalist at Wissahickon Trails, and we're going to talk all about backyard bird feeding tonight. Just a couple of things to keep in mind. There are a bunch of people on the call, about half of what we had registered so far, so some more people might jump on. I'm going to ask you to please keep your microphones muted and turn your camera off for a stronger internet connection if you start having, weird video effects. There's not really much I can do to help you. It's probably your connection, so sometimes not running your video can help. Please feel free to type in the chat box your questions, and I will stop a couple of times throughout the program tonight to look at those questions that are there. So feel free to type them in as they come to you. And this program is being recorded, so it will be available online usually in the next couple of days, certainly within a week. So if it doesn't show up and you really want to see it, feel free to, give me a shout, and we'll see what we can do. But it should be there in about a week. So, okay. As I said, we're here to talk about backyard bird feeding. And for those who are new to our organization, I just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania, founded a little over 60 years ago, really to protect the land and water of the Upper Wissahickon Creek. We largely operate in Montgomery County, although we work with partners in all of our neighboring counties, and especially in Philadelphia, as the Wissahickon does travel through the city of Philadelphia once it leaves Montgomery County. So we have a lot of partners in the area that we work with to keep the land clean and to help us protect land as well. To date, we've saved nearly 1,300 acres of land from development. And on that land, we have 12 nature preserves and about 24 miles of trails that are all out there for you to enjoy. We do rely on our supporters. So if you're on the call tonight and are a supporter, thank you. We really do rely on you to continue to achieve our mission and our work in the environment. If you're not a current supporter, I encourage you to go onto our website and take a look around, see the interactive trail maps, look at all the places that you can go and how to park and all of the fun stuff that's on that map, and a little bit more in depth about the work that we do. And hopefully that will encourage you to become a supporter as well. So just real quick, for tonight's plan, I'm going to talk briefly about sort of overall guidelines for creating bird-friendly yards. Then we'll do a little bit deeper dive into feeding stations and bird feeders and those kinds of things. Talk a little bit about safety issues, and then wrap up with a discussion of 2 citizen science projects that you can do from the comfort of your own house and backyard. So, and again, please feel free to type questions into the chat box as we're going through, and I'll stop throughout for questions. So, to start the discussion tonight about sort of overall bird-friendly backyards, I want to start with the idea of gardening for birds, because one of the best things that we can do is to provide natural environments for the birds and other creatures in our backyard. So real quickly, and we're not going to go, very in-depth in this, but some general bird-friendly backyard guidelines. Go native as much as you can. Remove invasive species. You'll see why this is particularly important in a minute, but it's not enough in some cases just to plant native plants, but sometimes we actively need to remove invasive species even in our own yard. Any amount of diversity that you can have in the plants that you have in the backyard, layers, trees, shrubs, lower flowering plants, all of those kinds of things. Diversity always increases other kinds of diversity. So if you have more plants, you will probably attract more insects. You will probably attract more species of birds to your yard. So it's all connected and all goes together. That's not to say you have to have everything in your own yard, but the more diversity that you can include, the better chances that you have of getting a diverse group of birds to come visit your yard. One of the single most important things that you can do is try to reduce your lawn area. While some birds like robins will use our lawns to try to find worms and things like that, The vast majority of our lawns pretty much are not wildlife friendly at all. They're kind of a dead zone for most animals, and most particularly most birds, actually. And so one of the things that you can really do is if you expand your garden areas and reduce your lawn, that's going to add to that increased level of diversity and make your yard overall more attractive. Plus, it saves you the energy and time of having to mow it all summer. Should go without saying, in most cases, no chemicals, unless there's something, really specific, but all the chemicals that you put in your yard either end up washing into the creek or stay in your yard where they are ingested by insects or the birds themselves and can have not so positive effects somewhere down the road. So we want to try to reduce our reliance on chemicals as much as possible. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of providing for all needs in the next couple of slides, but really the idea is to meet all the needs, cover, food, and water. And those kinds of additions to your yard are going to make it more friendly overall, beyond just having a bird feeder in your backyard. The other thing that you can do is go online and look into certifying your yard as a wildlife habitat. And I think that this is now I can't even remember which program this is. There's a couple of different programs out there that sort of allow you to certify your backyard. And basically, it's a statement that's saying, you are providing all of the cover and habitat needs and food and water needs that birds have or wildlife has in general. And it's a good way of sort of letting your neighbors know that you're doing this, because a lot of times people will have questions about, maybe things look a little overgrown or, those kinds of things. And it's not sort of the typical garden that a lot of people might expect to see. And having signs that it's a certified wildlife habitat often gets rid of a lot of those questions, and people are like, oh, that's cool, great, and they move on and won't give you a hard time about it, so to speak. So something that's really good to look into. And even if you don't specifically want to certify your habitat, taking a look online at the requirements for certifying your habitat will give you a better idea of some of the ways that you can sort of build on what I've just presented here. So one of the things that I said, providing cover, and we think of cover in a couple of different ways. So one is just protection from predators. And for a lot of birds, that's something that they can dive into where they can't be seen. So evergreen trees, ground covers, brush piles, like in this picture here, sparrows and other ground dwelling birds love these kinds of brush piles because they can hide in there really quickly, but they can also escape if they need to get away from a predator in the brush pile. Ground covers, again, not just a barren lawn, but having areas where there's ground covers often adds to the insect population and is very attractive to birds. We can also put roosting boxes or nest boxes in our yards. And really the recommendations here kind of depend on how much space you have. Most birds are not going to try to nest right on top of each other, but if you have sort of a typical backyard for the area, you might try putting up 1 or 2 nest boxes. In a very sort of urban area, you're most likely to probably get house sparrows, which you actually really want to discourage from nesting in your box. But anything else is fine. You might get wrens. They're a pretty popular backyard nest box inhabitant. House wrens are very good at building nests in boxes in our backyards and are fairly plentiful in the area in the summertime. So nest boxes, you might see those and see birds, frequenting those. There are specialized roosting boxes like this one here that some people put out in the winter. Again, not required, but if you have an area that you can do it and are interested in doing that, even a regular nest box in winter will provide. Some birds will huddle together in there when it's cold outside and create, their own sort of microenvironment of heat to protect them from the very cold or very wet weather. The roosting boxes serve the same purpose. It's a place where a number of birds, usually of the same species, chickadees and titmice and eastern bluebirds will often roost together in boxes, particularly during the winter when the weather's really bad. And then if you have an area where you can have sort of more dense shrub cover or more of like a thicket, those are the kind of things that birds really like, and that's where they will search out protective areas. And this idea of creating habitat layers, so use a variety of heights, use some smaller growing shrubs, use some higher shrubs, and then the full-on tree. And that gives you sort of that overall habitat layer, which again adds diversity to your yard and makes it more appealing to a wider variety of birds. So food is a key component of making your yard backyard friendly. And we're going to talk a lot about bird feeders and what bird food and all that kind of stuff, bird seed. But food in general is something that we sort of need to look at from a slightly different perspective, because we all think about, okay, I can hang up a bird feeder and I'm feeding the birds and that's great. And it is, and it's wonderful fun. And I highly encourage it because it's one of the ways that you're going to see birds in your backyard and learn to identify them and just, you know, have fun doing it. But when it comes to food for birds, insects are actually the primary food for most birds, particularly during the breeding season. And caterpillars, as shown here with this chickadee, are a very, very important source of food for nestlings. So birds that are developing in the nest, they've come out of the egg and they're hatched and they're just growing and growing their feathers. And in order to grow big enough to get out of the nest and to grow all of their feathers, they need a lot of very high quality protein. And caterpillars fit that bill to a T. It's been estimated that one nest of Carolina chickadees, which on average has 5 to 7 eggs roughly, needs about 9,000 caterpillars in one summer to raise their young. So you can imagine, multiply that by all of the other birds' nests that might be in a given area, and that's a lot of caterpillars. Caterpillars are part of an insect life cycle, and to attract insects to our yard, the best thing that we can do is plant native plants. Our insects rely on very specific plants to complete their life cycles. So if we think of monarchs and milkweed, for example, if we had no milkweed, we would have no monarchs because the caterpillars literally cannot eat anything else. And a lot of our other native insects are the same way. They rely on very specific native plants or plant families to complete their life cycles. So if we have native plants in our yard and we actively discourage non-native plants from growing, things like English ivy and other types of native plants, honeysuckles that are not native, and burning bushes and things like that, our native insects tend not to use those plants very much at all. And so they become dead zones for birds looking for food for the most part. And so planting native plants is one of the best ways that we can actually increase food sources for birds. And this actually has a year-round effect because a lot of these insects, the caterpillars, may not develop fully over the course of a summer, but they actually may spend the winter hidden in your leaf litter or in the cracks of a tree limb and under the bark, and birds will go looking for those. And so they become a source of food all year round, and a very important one. So plant native plants. If you have an area where you can safely leave a dead limb, do it, because again, that's going to attract certain insects and that's going to provide food for the birds. A lot of people actually go to the point of actually planting a dead tree in their yard. Usually, you know, not a ridiculously large one around, but a way that, you know, is sort of dead wood that woodpeckers and nuthatches and things like that would like to use. Excuse me. So nuts are another important source of food, and obviously they come from oak trees, but the single best tree that you can actually plant in your yard is an oak tree. If you have one now, great, you're lucky. If you don't, consider planting one. Over 500 species of insects use oaks as their host plant. So that's where their caterpillars will be living during the summer, and that's where birds are going to go for food. And so that is one of the best plants that you can plant in your yard. That's going to just magically increase insects in your yard, and you won't have to do anything else. So that's a lot of caterpillars for hungry birds, plus the nuts that it's going to produce for woodpeckers, jays, crows, ravens, all of those kinds of birds will come for the nuts. Sorry, oaks, yes. Berries, so things like elderberries, oops, sorry, went too far. Elderberries, which is shown here, winterberry hollies, which add a nice component of sort of in-between season color because they actually form their berries late in the season and they're bright red. So some winterberry hollies could have berries like now. And so they add a little bit of contrast for the fall colors. And then our native viburnums, which also make sort of mostly blue-black berries similar to the elderberries. All of these also, while the berries provide food for the birds in the fall, late summer into fall and early winter, they also attract insects because they're all flowering shrubs in the spring. So they'll all mostly have small white flowers, very attractive to insects and pollinators in our yard, which again is going to attract birds because they're going to eat the insects. So all connected. We can plant seeds in our yard, so things like sunflowers, coneflowers, or native meadow grasses. These are the native meadow grasses. This example here is actually a little blue stem. These things can get about 5 feet tall-ish. Mostly it's the seed heads that get that tall, but they're not what we think of as grass like our lawn. They're actually clumping grasses. And so they provide seed, they provide cover. A lot of them sort of stay upright throughout the winter. The dormant parts of the grass stay sort of above the ground and provide cover for the birds throughout the winter as well. And so they can provide, you don't have to have a whole area of just those plants, but you can use them throughout your garden plan as accents and just sort of help balance out your composition. They're a great sort of filler plant, if you will. And there's a number of varieties out there, some bigger, some smaller, but all provide sort of that same basic proposition for the birds, seeds and cover. And then lastly, nectar is a really easy thing that we can provide in our yard. There's 3 native sources in our area. Trumpet vine, shown here, is sort of these orangey pink flowers, a little bit big kind of tubes. Cardinal flower is this one here in the middle. Great if you've got a slightly wet spot, damp spot. They like to keep their feet a little wet. And then lastly, this coral honeysuckle. All of these are native. All of these are extremely attractive to hummingbirds. So if you have a place that you can plant vines in your yard, highly recommend, because that is one of the best ways to get hummingbirds to come visit. But if you don't have a place that you can plant the vines, things like cardinal flower and bee balm, monarda, that one also is very attractive to hummingbirds as well. Water is really important. Just like us, birds need water year-round for drinking and bathing. Regular bathing, even in winter, helps them keep their feathers in absolutely peak condition. So providing water actually is a really good way of attracting species of birds that won't come to your feeders, because there's a lot of species out there that really don't care about the feeders that we put in our yard. But if you have water in your yard, you might have a really good chance of seeing them. So, but birds can be really particular about their water sources. So let's start with the not so ideal option. So we often see bird baths like this, with this big pedestal and a big basin and filled to the brim, and it's rather deep. And while you may get some birds coming to visit, most likely larger birds like robins or blue jays that will sit on the edge and get a drink. Typically speaking, these kinds of bird baths don't work very well. Birds do not particularly like to be up in the ground to bathe. They like to be on the ground, and these are too deep for most birds to use. And again, as I said, you may get some, but you might not get as many as if you take a slightly different approach to get a shallow kind of container, put some rocks in the bottom. The water really only needs to be about 1.5 inches deep or so. The container itself only about 2 inches. You can use smaller stones like this or a larger flat one. I actually prefer the larger flat kind of option because it's just easier to clean when you clean the feeder rather than trying to make sure all of the individual stones are clean. Excuse me, but you can use a couple little flat rocks in there, one that's mostly submerged and another one that maybe sits just above the water level, and that helps the birds judge how deep it is and where they can get in to take a bath. And honestly, the easiest and most inexpensive option is a planter tray, just like this one. Any home goods store is going to have them, and if they get broken, if they crack, if they whatever, they're very easy to replace, and they're not a huge investment from a financial point of view. They're easy to clean as well. The other thing that you might want to consider in your yard, and literally they can sit on the ground. If even with the one I showed in the beginning on the left here, if you took this basin off the pedestal, set it on the ground and put a big rock in the middle of it, it would probably be more appealing to a wider variety of birds than up in the air like this. The other thing that you might want to consider for your yard, if you have a way to run electricity and to run water out into your yard, is to consider a mister or a dripper. So on the top here is a mister. These can go on the edge of bird baths. They can go actually into trees or shrubs. And a lot of times, so hummingbirds love this. This is how hummingbirds bathe. They fly through this mist. And so by having this in your yard can attract hummingbirds and some other birds who will use that as their bird bath. And it can be really cool to see them do that. This is, you need to have water running through here, and they usually need some source of power slightly to make them run. I've seen people run them, and I have done this in the past, where you run them on a timer. So they only run for, an hour or two every afternoon, and the birds will learn that that's when it's on and time their arrival to come check out the misters. So that's one thing that you can do. There are bird baths like this one here on the bottom that you can buy. I've actually used this bird bath. This is a really cool idea because it looks like rocks. It's sort of meant to blend in your yard, but actually in the basin are a couple of different levels. So when you fill the water up, it actually has different heights in there, which is attractive to different species of birds. The bigger ones can go in the deeper areas and the smaller ones can go in the shallow areas. And it sort of accommodates everything. And then it has this dripper that attaches. This one just needs a hose, and you turn the water pressure on really, really low and just let a couple drips drip out, every couple seconds. And again, it's that sound of running water can actually help attract birds to find your bird bath and your water. And it's not something you necessarily have to have on all the time every day, but when you're there and can pay attention to it, you don't want your bath overflowing and making a mess in your yard, but having that on can really be a powerful attractant to birds and letting them know that you have water in your yard. And as I said, water in winter is actually extremely important as well. Birds still need to have water to drink, and when everything is frozen, it can be difficult for them to find free water. And they will also actually bathe. They won't do it as much as during the warmer months, but if we have a couple of warm days and you have a bird bath in your backyard, you will see birds galore taking a bath, even in February. This is an example from a video that I grabbed on YouTube. Somebody actually had a red-shouldered hawk visit their winter water source here because it was one of the few things in the area that had free water that the bird could get a drink. So again, this hawk's not going to visit your feeders to eat your sunflower seeds, but it might come visit your yard for water. So again, that diversity of species comes from the diversity of things that you can offer them. In winter, you have a couple of different options. This middle tray here is the one that's being used, and it literally just plugs into an extension cord that you run from your house, and it has a thermostat, so it only turns on when it's necessary and keeps the water from freezing. If you have a bird bath that can stand it, and this depends entirely on the bird bath that you have, obviously like a plastic planter tray, like I suggested, is not going to work for this. This is a submersible heater. Again, you run it from a power source. The problem with most of these is they don't turn off. They're kind of on all the time. I've used this bird bath here that the red-shouldered hawk is in, and I like it. It's a little expensive, so I tend, when I have had it, I don't put it out all year round. I use the cheap planter ones in the summer in case they get beat up or broken, and then in the winter I switch to being able to use this one just to make it last a little bit longer. It's still less than $100, but it's a lot more expensive than, you know, the planter trays that I use in the summertime. So I'm going to stop here for questions before we dive into talking more about feeders and feed and all of that kind of stuff. So I saw a few things pop up here, and let's see what we've got. Yes, thank you. National Wildlife Foundation is the certification that I showed you the picture of. And that's one that I would actually recommend that you look into. Theirs is probably one of the more comprehensive ones that's out there. And the requirements that they have are going to help you, you know, sort of, you know, make your yard friendly for wildlife overall, all of which is going to benefit the birds, you know, even if that's not your main goal. Somebody's asking, can you recommend good shrubs for a shade area? And not right off the top of my head. If you email me to remind me, I can try to get back to you. I will say on our YouTube channel, there are a couple of webinars from earlier this spring that are specifically about planting for birds and planting for wildlife in your backyard. And so I would go ahead and give those videos a look, because they're going to have way more information than I'm going to be able to give you tonight about very specific plants for your areas. Hold on one second. Somebody. Okay. So another question about plants, English ivy. Yeah, honestly, I'm going to say go watch those videos, and if they can't help answer your questions, give me shoot me an email back, and I'll see if I can get some very specific recommendations for you. Protecting smaller birds. And we're going to talk about hawks in a minute, and we're going to talk about squirrels. We're going to get there, because I know those are the two questions that everybody always has. So give me a second and we will get there. Okay, so moving forward, feeder stations. So elements of a good feeding station, a couple of examples of pictures here. This top one is actually a European feeder. This is a great spotted woodpecker that we don't have here, but so don't be thrown by the birds. But the idea is elements of a good feeding station are not that different from the elements of sort of making your yard bird friendly overall. Variety of foods, variety of feeder types. Again, that variety increases diversity, diversity of heights. It's very helpful to have landing spots or branches, like branches or trees nearby. Here that you can see in this bottom picture, they sort of built a structure, giving the birds a place to perch when they're coming to the feeders. Having cover nearby is really important. Birds need an escape route, and they will fly, but oftentimes they like to just dive into cover as quickly as they possibly can. So having your feeding station near shrubs, but not right. This is actually a little bit too close to the cover on the bottom. Predators could sneak up here and not be seen until it's too late. So you do want to have a little bit of space between your actual feeding stations and the area that you're offering for cover. So if there's feral cats in the area, if a hawk, comes by, the birds will have a chance to see that. and get to cover. Old Christmas trees, once your Christmas tree is done in December and you don't know what to do with it, throw it in your backyard. It is a wonderful way of providing really quick cover for the birds around your feeders. And, you know, it's just going to sort of disintegrate there, and you can move it out of the way at the end of the winter and discard it if you want to, add it to your compost bin, whatever. But that's a really quick, easy way of providing cover to your yard in winter. And then water, and again, especially in winter, heated to prevent freezing. So I want to talk about bird feeder types just quickly, and I'm sure most of you are probably pretty familiar with this, but the reason why I bring this up, so basically kind of categorizing them in three different ways. Tube feeders, so this one here on the top left with sort of a sunflower seed mix in it, this one here on the bottom with the blue jay with peanuts in it. You can see there, this one's either glass or plastic, we can't really tell. This one's an open mesh design. The one with the goldfinch is also a tube feeder, plastic probably in this case, with metal, and a finch seed mix inside of it. So these kinds of feeders are going to have different openings for different kinds of food. And that can be really helpful because different birds like different kinds of food, and two, different kinds of feeders. So we also have hoppers like this one up here on the top right. These are designed to hold a lot of food. They typically have these platform edges on the bottom of them where the birds can sit, and they can generally accommodate a wide variety of birds. We can have tray feeders like the one that the cardinal's sitting on. These can either be on the ground or they can be elevated. This one has hangers, so it can hang from a hook. Some of them actually have a bottom that allows you to screw a post into it, so it can actually sit on top of a post. And then suet is another good thing to offer, especially in the winter. And you typically do need a specialized feeder for that, either something that can hold the blocks of suet like this, or a new thing, not new, but another option is suet feeders that look more like a log with openings in them that you can stuff the suet into. They typically either come in balls that you stuff in there, or in sort of logs that you can just put in those holes. And again, it is important to try to offer some variety if you can. I understand not everybody has the space, not everybody has the ability to, you know, have 4 or 5 different kinds of feeders, but really do give some thought to the space you have and the kinds of things that you want to offer in terms of food, because that will impact the kind of birds that you get. So cardinals, for example, here, they really do not like tube feeders. They will go to them in a pinch, mostly more these open ones if they can, for like sunflower seeds, but they would much rather be on a tray or on the ground. They will sometimes go to hoppers if they have a large enough edge for them to sit on, but they really don't like the tube feeders. So if you want a lot of cardinals in your yard, think about ways that you can offer food on a flat surface, either a tray directly on the ground, or, you know, whatever. And that's, again, true for a lot of different kinds of birds. Some like certain feeders better than others. And again, any kind of increased variety typically means increased number of species in your yard. Real quick to talk about some other feeders. So we introduced suet feeders, which is kind of a specialty feeder there. There are a number of other specialty kind of feeders, but in general, any kind of feeder, there's 3 things that you should think about when you're looking at purchasing one. Is it easy to fill? Because if it's hard to get stuff into it, it's not very much fun to have to do it every day. Is it easy to clean? And we're going to talk about why that's important in a bit. And can water drain out of it? If the seed gets wet, the seed can go bad, and the seed can get moldy, and that's bad for the birds. And so it needs to have a way to let the water drain out, and ideally let the seed dry if possible. And so those are kind of the three things that you want to think about when you're looking at feeders for your backyard. And if you're debating about whether to replace any of the feeders that you have, ask yourself these questions and say, okay, no, that one's really hard to clean and it's impossible to clean, and I should get rid of that one first and replace it with this. So again, just keep that in mind. And there are tons of specialty feeders out there for all kinds of things. So you can get a feeder that you can feed whole peanuts from. You can get feeders that are going to help protect from anything that's not a bird, which we're going to talk more about in a minute. And then for specialized things like Niger seed for goldfinches, you need a feeder that has specialized feeding ports, because these seeds are so small that they will just fall right out of feeders that have larger ports. So this is a goldfinch feeder in essence. And again, from a cleaning perspective, materials matter. This kind of a feeder is going to be really difficult to clean. It's wooden. It's not easy to get into the whole thing. It doesn't come apart. Whereas this feeder on the bottom comes completely apart. It's metal. It's really easy to clean. And that's going to go a long way towards keeping your bird feeding station and the birds in your backyard happy and healthy. From a storage perspective, these are the two systems that I found that work the best. These stackable containers, you can get these at like Petco, often online. Walmart used to have them. I don't know if they still do, but a variety of kind of stores like that. Feed stores, grain stores will have something similar to these. But the idea is they're stackable. The seal, when it's screwed in tightly, is mouse proof, which is important when you're storing this in your shed or in your garage. And they're really, really heavy duty plastic. So the mice can't chew through them. I've never had a mouse chew through these, and I've had them in sheds for years and in my garage, and they're just fine. And they keep the seed fresh. And that is another thing that's going to go a long way towards keeping the birds in your backyard happy. The other thing that I've used with great success is a metal trash can with a tight fitting lid, sometimes with bungee cord wrapped over the top of it to help keep very aggressive squirrels out of it. But I actually have used this system when I lived in an apartment and I had to keep all my bird seed on my back patio, and it worked to keep the squirrels out of it. So these kinds of things can go a long way just towards making, seed can get messy. It can get difficult to deal with. And these kinds of storage systems can just help keep things organized, keep things clean, and keep pests and critters out of it, so that you're able to feed it all to the birds. So I said we're going to talk about the top 10 foods for feeding in the overall program announcement, but we're actually going to talk about the top 9 foods for feeding, because you can see here I've crossed one off. Cracked corn is not something that I would actually really recommend that you put in your backyard feeding stations. It's not going to hurt anything, but it tends to mostly attract pests more than anything else. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But you can see here, there's 9 options, loads of options that you can use to feed the birds. And this is sort of the very most basic. There's sort of all manner of mixes and combinations of these things that you can get as well. But from a high level perspective, if you really only want to offer one thing, you can either offer black oil sunflower seed, which is this here, or a good mixed seed. I'm going to talk about what makes up a good mixed seed in a second. But both of these will be the most appealing to the widest variety of birds. Excuse me. So if you just want to have one feeder, pick either this sunflower seed or a good mixed seed option, and that's it. You're good to go. The black oil sunflower seeds are the easiest to get open, so they will attract a wide variety of birds. Down here in this grain mix on the lower left, the one in to the right, you can see these striped sunflower seeds. These are bigger, these are harder to open, and so they limit some of the birds that can use them. So that's why the black oil is sort of preferred by more species. But a good mixed seed is a really critical part of your feeding station as well, and a good way to sort of diversify out of just sunflower seeds. Two examples down here of good quality mixed seeds. So what you want to look for is something that is predominantly sunflowers, has a little bit of peanuts thrown in most of the time, so you can see the split peanuts in both of these mixes. The mix on the right actually has safflowers, which is what my cursor is on right now. These are seeds that typically tend to attract birds that will open even harder to open shells, like cardinals. They're not particularly popular with a lot of the other birds, so typically we tend to say they're for cardinals. Some other birds will use them, like jays and things, but they can be in the mix. And then the other thing that typically rounds out mixes are what we call fillers, and it's typically milo or proso millet. You want to stay away from milo, and I don't have a good example of it, but if you've ever had a bird seed or looked at a bird seed, or when you go to look at bird seed the next time, if you see little red balls, so these little yellow balls that are in the mix on the left here, this is millet, and this is fine. Wait a minute, I'm going to say that backwards. They're both, yes, this is millet, this is fine. The yellow is good. The red is bad. Red is always bad. The red is milo, and it is a total filler. It's a cheap filler, and most birds won't eat it. Squirrels will sometimes, and it just tends to attract mice and other things, and you're not really using it to feed the birds. So if a mix is largely that, it's not as good a quality as it could be for the birds. Likewise, if a mix is largely these tiny little yellow balls of millet, that's not really good either. You really want it to look like seeds, and predominantly sunflower seeds and peanuts or other nuts that are mixed in. The difference between these two seed mixes here is the one on the left has everything out of the shell. So it's a no waste mix. Which if you're in an area where that's of particular concern for you and you don't want to have to worry about the mess on the ground from sunflower seeds and things like that, no waste mixes cost more up front, but the birds are eating everything. So yes, when you buy just a bag of black oil sunflower seed in the shell, it's going to be much, much cheaper than a no waste mix, but the birds aren't eating all of those shells. They're just waste. So that's the cost difference essentially. So keep that in mind when you look at costs of no waste mixes, because they really do eat it all, and there is no waste to that. It's not a requirement. That's a personal preference, really, from that perspective. The birds are perfectly happy to take the time to get things out of the shell. And so that's really just a personal preference. Suet, as I said, is another great option in the winter. In the summer, it can tend to get kind of messy, although I've had times there are no melt versions that I've tried to leave out into the breeding season, and I've noticed that birds were coming for them and feeding their recently fledged birds. And I think it's because it's soft and it's an easy, high calorie source of food for them. So if you choose to leave a no melt version out in the summer, it can be very helpful to the birds as well, but it's not a requirement. I typically tend to use it more only in the winter. Peanuts are another great thing, will attract a lot of species, woodpeckers, nuthatches, chickadees, titmice, all like peanuts as well. You can do split peanuts like are in these mixes, or that we saw in the feeder, sort of the whole peanuts. And you can do peanuts in a shell, which will attract jays and sometimes crows to come and pick them out. And jays are infinite amounts of fun to watch them take the peanuts out of the feeder and try to get the peanuts out of the shell. So again, not something you have to have out all the time, but something that you might want to throw out as an occasional treat. I already talked about Niger seed. It's often called thistle seed. It's not actually thistle. It's the seed from the African yellow daisy, it is sterilized, so it's not going to sprout in your yard. So don't worry that you're growing thistle if it falls out of the feeder, but it is really tiny. It is like gold to goldfinches. They love this stuff. And so if you want goldfinches to visit your feeder, you need to feed this. The other thing that really likes this seed is pine siskins, and there are a lot of them in the area this fall. They've sort of all come down from the boreal north, and they are all over the area. So if you're feeding this in your yard, you may see these at your feeder as well. So encourage you to keep, you know, a lookout for them. They kind of look like, if you're not familiar with them, they're about the size of a goldfinch, but they're really, really streaked. And they have a little bit of yellow on their wings and at the base of their tail, sort of on their back. And there's usually a flock of them. They don't usually come like one or two. There's usually half a dozen or more at least. We talked about safflower can be used to attract cardinals. It's one of the things that people say squirrels aren't supposed to eat, but that's not really true. They'll adapt if it's the only thing that's out there. And as I mentioned before, it's really hard to crack. So if it's the only thing that you're feeding, that's going to limit the birds that are the species that are going to come to your feeder. You'll get cardinals and you may get a few others, but you're not going to get a lot of chickadees or titmice or things like that, because they just can't open the safflower very well at all. Cracked corn it attracts more pests than anything else, and bird pests and non-bird pests, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it sometimes is in grain mixes or seed mixes. And again, it's a personal choice. You're not going to do any harm by putting it out there, but it's also sort of a cheap filler because there are a lot of birds that won't eat it. So again, up to you. Mealworms are another really good source of protein and energy. In the winter, in the breeding season, you can use live mealworms, which if you have bluebirds in your area and you know you have bluebirds in your area, I highly recommend this. You can get a specialized bluebird feeder that has, you know, entrance holes on either end and clear plastic in the middle, and you can put some mealworms in there and the bluebirds actually go into the feeder. The idea is to keep them from crawling out. You can also just offer mealworms in a tray, but if they're live, they may crawl away before the birds get to them. The enclosed feeder sort of keeps them in place better. Bluebirds love these. So if you have bluebirds in your area, I highly encourage you to think about getting some live ones and feeding them. But I tend to use these dried ones, and I sort of mix them in my seed mix that I put in my tray feeder in the winter. Again, extra protein boost, you know, just attractive to some birds that might not want to eat sunflowers or don't really eat peanuts and things like that. So high calorie, high protein. Along with that comes these things like these suet nuggets. Again, these things can be dropped into some kinds of feeders. They can also just be mixed into your seed mix on a tray feeder. Again, just a high fat, high calorie energy boost, particularly in the winter when it's cold outside. Fruit can be offered. We think a lot of times oranges and grape jelly for Orioles. I've actually had more luck having gray catbirds come to oranges than I have Orioles, but you know, you may have better luck than me. They can be staked out like this. I've often used suet block feeders and sliced the oranges and just stuck them in there and hang them in the tree. Mockingbirds really like raisins that have been soaked in a little bit of water to plump them up. But I do have to say, for any kind of dried fruit, or if some seed mixes come with fruit in them, if you have dogs, don't feed raisins. because there's no way of knowing that whether those raisins are going to end up in a place that the dogs can get them, and they are very bad for dogs. So if you have dogs or have a place where dogs can have access to any place around your feeders, don't use anything that has raisins in it, and be careful when you buy seed mixes because sometimes they do have dried raisins in them. So dried cherries, dried cranberries, all of those things can come in them as well, and those are more acceptable and not as harmful to dogs as the raisins are. So just keep that in mind if you have dogs. And then nectar. We're going to talk about hummingbirds in a second and get more into that. But that's in addition to, the plants that you can plant for nectar. You can offer nectar in a feeder, obviously, both for hummingbirds and for orioles as well. They will sometimes visit feeders. Okay. So we're going to talk about dealing with bird pests first. And if you don't know what a bird pest is, then you've probably never had them, and yay for you. But these are the 4 most common bird pests that we have visiting our feeders. European starlings, house sparrows, rock pigeons, rock doves, however you want to describe them, and common grackles. And the biggest problem with these guys is not that they're there. They're birds. We can feed them. That's fine. The only one that are actually native are the grackles. The others were all introduced species, but for all intents and purposes, they are here now. They're not rare. There's a lot of them, and that's usually the problem with these guys. You don't usually get 1 or 2 of these birds. You can have 20 or 30 or 40 of them, especially starlings and grackles. Grackles in the springtime, when they come back to the area after the winter, they can form massive flocks, and they can just wipe out your feeders literally in a matter of minutes. Same with the starlings. And house sparrows, again, usually there's not just a few of them, there's a lot of them. So some of the things that you can do to help prevent these guys, or, most of the issue with this is people are like, I don't want to only feed these birds. I want to feed the good birds. I don't want to feed these birds. So limit ground feeding. A lot of these birds, like the pigeons and the house sparrows, really do like to feed on the ground. So limiting ground feeding will help that. You can choose feeders to exclude. So like some of the feeders, like I showed you, that have a cage around them, they're too big for starlings or grackles to get into, but those holes are usually small enough for house finches and chickadees or titmice or things like that to get in there and to get to the food. They won't exclude house sparrows because they're on the small side, and they might also exclude cardinals, for example, or blue jays because they're bigger. But those kinds of things can help. Starlings really like, and grackles too, but starlings, I've seen this particularly, they like suet, and they can just eat you out of house and home with suet. They don't really like to hang upside down to eat. So there are suet block holders that kind of have a peaked roof on the top, and then the block goes in and it's mesh on the bottom that the birds can eat through, and the bird literally has to hang upside down on that underneath of it to get to the food. And while starlings will do it, they won't go through that as quickly as they would if it was just a free hanging block of suet. So you can choose feeders like that that will sort of help to try to exclude. This is where avoiding corn, and it should say, millet is attractive to these guys. Milo, they still really won't eat, but the millet in the mixes can be attractive, particularly to the pigeons. So if pigeons are a problem, try to choose mixes that don't contain that, and that will help disperse them. The other thing is, if you're really overrun, the best thing that you can do is just take your feeders down for a little bit. The birds are not going to be dependent on our feeders to provide them with all of their nutrition. If they were, they would be in your yard all the time when it's daylight. And if you notice, most feeding, if you've spent any time watching feeders that you might have had, birds come and go. And so you'll get sort of this brief rush of birds in the morning as everybody's waking up and they've spent the night not eating and they've got to fuel and they've got to get ready for the day. And then they kind of all disappear, usually except for things like house sparrows and pigeons and starlings. They kind of just go on their own way. And that's because they're working their way around the neighborhood, looking for insects, looking for berries that might still be hanging on a tree, looking for nuts that might still be hanging on a tree, and sort of just making their own way in the world. And your feeder is sort of that one stop. So while the birds are going to, sort of come to, quote, rely on your feeder, they're not dependent on your feeder. So you're not going to hurt the other birds if you do have to take your feeders down for a couple of days to try to get these flocks to disperse. And usually that will happen in a couple of days, and then you can hang your feeders back up. And if these flocks build back up, do the same thing. And that's just going to, disperse the birds. And that is probably the best way of dealing with them. So the other two bird pests that we have are Cooper's hawk and sharp-shinned hawk. And this is a juvenile Cooper. They look very much alike. There's a few key field marks to tell them apart. For our purposes tonight, we're not going to go through, but what I've included here on the left, this is a juvenile bird. Both juvenile Coopers and sharp-shins will look like this, the brown streaking up and down the chest. The adult birds on the right are orange barred streaks across the chest and much more gray on the back instead of the brown. So this is a juvenile bird here. This is a Cooper's hawk on the left, and this is an adult sharp-shinned on the right, but they're going to look very similar between the species. So there's really not much you can do. If a bird has decided to stake out your feeder for the winter, which they will do, they will know that you have bird feeders in your backyard, and they will make your yard part of their rounds. And they probably have other rounds around the neighborhood as well, but they will sort of stay there. There really is not much that you can do. You can make sure that you have cover offered to the birds so they have a place to fly to. The birds in your feeder. And again, the best way is to try to remove your feeders to disperse the birds. If you take your feeders down for a few days, all of the other neighborhood birds are not going to spend as much time in your yard, and that's going to discourage that hawk from staying around. It is, this is one of those things, it doesn't bother me. I know that it's, going to happen. And honestly, most of the times that I've had a Cooper's or a sharp-shinned hawk in my yard, they get house sparrows. And I'm kind of like, you can have all the house sparrows you want to have. I'm one of those bird feeders who doesn't bother if I have a hawk in my yard at my feeders. And I know that I'm not, everybody doesn't feel the same way. And so, the only thing that you can really do is take your feeders down to disperse the birds, and hopefully the hawk will go find someplace else to hang out. But other than that, there's not really much that you can do to discourage them. That's just, they like to hang out, and your feeders are their feeder as well. So everybody's favorite non-bird pest, squirrels, raccoons, and chipmunks. And squirrels are usually by far the biggest culprit. And I'm just going to say right up front, there is no magic bullet for dealing with these pests that will fix the problem. If you put food out for the birds, other animals will be attracted to it. It is just a fact of life. You can take the approach of, okay, I don't care, I'm just going to feed them all, and it is what it is. You can work really, really hard to follow the recommendations that I'm going to give you to try to exclude them from your feeders as much as possible. All of these things, your mileage may vary. These are general recommendations that I can make, but depending on the tenacity of the squirrels that you have, the number of squirrels that you have, all of those things are going to impact whether or not they're going to be a problem at your feeders. So the first thing that you want to do is place the feeders, I say 10 feet, 7 to 10 feet roughly, from anything a squirrel can jump from. The ground, So the bottom of your feeder needs to be that high off the ground, from a tree, from a fence, from a shrub, from your car, a roof, anything. So generally speaking, squirrels can't jump more than 5 feet, like straight up in the air, to grab onto the bottom of the feeder. They won't jump more than about 7 feet across from something. So a fence or a tree, from a tree to a tree, or from a fence to the feeder, kind of a thing. And coming from the top down, they tend not to drop more than about 9 feet from above. So again, that sort of 7 to 10 feet roughly from anything that they can jump from is the first way that you can try to keep them off of your feeders. And if you keep your feeder station set up so that it's these kind of recommendations, that's going to go a long way towards keeping the squirrels off of your feeders. Along with that, you can use baffles above and below your feeders. So these two on the left here, the one on the left here is a baffle above the feeder. The idea with this is the squirrel can't hold on to the hook and can't reach around the baffle to get to the feeder. These have measuring levels of success for people, to be honest. And a lot of it depends on, what the feeder is attached to. If the feeder is attached to a tree and a tree branch it's hanging from, there's a really good chance that the squirrel is going to have enough stability to try to figure out how to do this. If this is hanging from a feeder station pole that's way up in the air and not on a tree or anything else that a squirrel can jump from, it may go a long way towards keeping a squirrel coming down from the top any way that it can get there. On the bottom, you can use baffles like these two here. This one is somewhat effective for squirrels, but it's small enough that raccoons could actually get around it to your feeders. So I just recommend people look at getting these long ones like this here on the right. They're usually called stovepipe baffles. You can make your own inexpensively. You can certainly purchase them from any birdseed supplier. These are going to help keep raccoons off of your feeders as well. And so if you're going to put baffles on, you might as well prevent both squirrels and raccoons. So I recommend these longer ones if you want to use a baffle. You can use squirrel-proof feeders, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. One, the cage option, like excluding bigger birds. This is going to exclude squirrels from getting to the feeding ports, but still allow the smaller birds into the cage. There are a number of options. Both of these other feeders kind of work the same way. They have a sliding mechanism that the weight of the squirrel pulls the cover over the feeder ports so it can't get to them. So here this metal cage slides down. In this case, it's the rail here. Any excessive weight on this closes off the feeder port from the squirrel. Again, varying levels of success depending on how many squirrels you have, how aggressive they are, how well made the feeders are. There are also feeders. I have never used these. I've used the cage method, and I've used this slidey one here. This is actually a feeder I've actually had. I've never used these, but mostly that's because I don't use hopper feeders. I find them very difficult to keep clean. And so I tend to use the tube feeders more and tray feeders. These, have worked fairly well for keeping squirrels off, but there are other ones that are actually mechanized that when a squirrel gets on it, it spins around and spits the squirrel off. You can go search videos for them. I've never used them. I don't know if they actually work to keep the squirrel away from the food. I mean, they do to a certain extent if it's really literally throwing the squirrel off. I've never used them, so I can't recommend them or not. I have used both of these, and they have worked to help reduce the squirrels in my yard. And then the other thing is, if you can't beat them, join them. Consider adding a separate feeding station for squirrels. So you can do things like whole ears of corn, dried corn. There's a number of different, so this idea of making the squirrel work for it, here they have to actually go inside to get the food out, and it's just a bit more of a challenge. There are other things where you can mount like 6 of these dried ear corns on like a spinny kind of thing. Again, it's to attract them, give them something to do somewhere away from your feeders. Likewise, these big giant, now birds will eat this seed mix too, but this is a big giant compressed block of bird seed that you can put in some other part of your yard if you have space to do that. That ideally, you know, it's really easy for the squirrels to get to. They don't have to do any work, and they'll just go there instead of your feeders. Now, you may still get some on your feeders for sure, but if you're giving them easy access to other foods, then, you know, it may be you have less on your feeders and there's less competition for the birds. I would ask you though, one of the things that's out there, you'll see it any place you go to buy birdseed just about, is, you know, foods that have hot pepper in them, you know, to deter squirrels. Please don't use them. We really don't know the long-term effects of that cayenne pepper on birds and the birds' digestive systems and all of that kind of stuff. So that's really not a good option for us to use. And in addition, there's been a lot of, it's anecdotal, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that if that's the only bird food that you have out, the squirrels will adapt. They might stay away for a little while, but if that's all you're feeding, then eventually they will overcome their lack of taste for that hot pepper food, and they will eat that seed anyway. And again, we really don't know the impact on the birds. So try to stay away from any kind of artificial something like that that's marketed as trying to, you know, prevent squirrels. You're better off with, honestly, these more mechanical methods. Deer, again, there is no magic bullet for deer. Avoiding ground feeders, you know, that's one way to kind of try to do it. Hanging the feeders 7 to 8 feet above the ground. Deer will stand up on their hind legs to get to food, but they can only reach so far. And so, you know, if you have things high up in the air, you're going to prevent them from being eaten by deer in the mix. I will say, I have to say, I say this every time I do this program. This feeder here in the middle of the squirrel proof feeders, I literally had this exact feeder in my yard, and it's squirrel proof for sure. The squirrels get on it, the cage slides down. It is not deer proof, however. The deer actually figured out that they could push down just enough with their tongues to move the cage, open the feeder port, and just lick the seed out of the feeder. So, you know, what works for one species might not work for another species. So, yeah, again, you're going to have to probably try different things if you're really having problems with deer. The other thing that you can do for all of these things is, and this is true, so raccoons, deer, anything like that, putting your feeders in at night and putting them back out in the daytime is another way of trying to keep those creatures and pests away from your feeders. Raccoons are pretty much only active nocturnally, so they can come in the middle of the night and completely wipe out your feeders. And if they constantly have that source of food and there's a lot of raccoons in your area, they will do that. And so one of the ways to prevent that from happening is take your feeders down at night. Or if you see raccoons are wiping you out, put your feeders away at night for a couple of days. And again, they'll move on. Same with deer. Now, I know deer around here can tend to be more active all day long. And so this isn't a foolproof solution, but typically deer are more active at dawn and dusk. And so if you take your feeders down and put them out in the morning again, then you have a better chance of maybe not having the deer around quite so much and in your food. But as I said, there's no magic bullets for these guys, and it really depends on the animals you have in your yard and how much effort you want to make. There is nothing that says you have to keep the squirrels off your feeder. You know, if you want the squirrels to feed, fine. If you don't want to feed them, these are the best recommendations that I can give you to try to prevent them from being in your feeders. I will make a note here about bears, because bears are a real problem with feeders in some areas of the country. And thankfully for us in our immediate area, bears are not really an issue. But if you are in a place that has bears, if you have a vacation house or you're listening to this from somewhere out of our immediate Wissahickon Trails area, please, please, please follow all local rules about when or if you can have a bird feeder out, because bears coming to bird feeders, particularly in the spring as they break hibernation, is a huge problem. And it's not good for humans to be around bears, but it's really not good for the bears, because nuisance bears usually don't get to live for very long. And so we want to make sure that if we're in an area that has bears, we follow the local rules about when we're allowed to have our feeder out. And usually that means when the bears are not out. So typically in a lot of areas on the East Coast, it's around the middle of November to the feeders have to come down by the end of March or the very beginning of April in some cases. And so again, if you're in an area with bears, just keep that in mind and don't feed the birds when the bears are out, because you'll end up feeding bears. And the other thing I will say, just in sort of an overall, in terms of dealing with these pests, as I'm calling them here, having smaller feeders that are really only filled with the amount of food that the birds that visit your area can eat in a day can go a long way towards keeping these pests out of your food. So kind of keep an eye on that. If you have feeders that are sitting full for days at a time, they probably either you don't need as many feeders in your yard, or you can fill those feeders less full so that they get emptied faster. And yes, it means a little bit more work for you, because you might have to be refilling feeders a little bit more frequently if they're smaller or you're not filling them all the way up. But it can go a long way towards limiting access to these kinds of pests. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And I just want to wrap up this section before I take questions to talk about hummingbirds. So please, 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 please do not use this ready-to-use hummingbird nectar of any kind, whether it's liquid or powder, that has red dye in it. We do not know the impacts. I mean, that is literally food coloring, which a lot of us try to keep out of our diets as much as we can. So let's not feed it to the birds as well. It is super, super simple to make your own nectar. Put a pot on, boil some water, measure out 4 cups of that boiled water while it's still hot, and add a cup of sugar. Stir to dissolve. You have hummingbird nectar. You're done. You can store that in your refrigerator. And basically, once it's in the refrigerator, just want to make sure, watch for mold growing in it, or watch if it gets cloudy in the container. Then it's time to start over again. So again, super simple to make your own nectar. And if you have a lot of those flowers in your yard that I mentioned earlier, you may not even need to put out a hummingbird feeder. You will probably get hummingbirds, on their own, because they really like to come to those flowers, the native honeysuckles and the cardinal flowers. So if you have those in your yard, you may not even have to take the time to deal with a feeder. Store in the refrigerator, watch for mold. So a couple of things to keep in mind about hummingbird feeders. So both of these feeders are perfectly acceptable. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I found this to be true in my own use of feeders as well. If you use feeders that are just all red on them with no yellow, you tend to get less bees and wasps and yellow jackets and all of that kind of stuff attracted to your feeder. You may still get some, but for some reason, they tend to be much, much more attracted to feeders that have yellow ports of any kind. So you can buy feeders like this on the left that have no yellow on them. And if you're worried about bees, or, just don't want to have to deal with that, highly encourage you to get one that doesn't have yellow on it. The other thing I do recommend, this is an ant guard, and you can buy these online. You can buy them, a lot of places that sell bird seed and feeders also sell these as well. This just helps keep ants off your feeder, and it just helps keep things neat and clean, and it's easier to pick up and take into your house to clean because it's not covered with ants. So again, not a requirement, but it just makes things a little bit easier to deal with, because if you don't have this, you will get ants on your feeder, and they can just be annoying and just make a mess out of everything. So a couple of things to keep in mind, particularly with hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are really sensitive to dirty food, even more so than other birds are. So if you put a hummingbird feeder out, you really need to make the commitment to taking care of it, particularly through the heat of the summer. You will need to change the nectar every day. You won't have to make new. You have that stash in the refrigerator, and you just fill up from the refrigerator, dump out the old, put fresh in, and put it back out. But you really kind of do need to do that every day, especially when it's really hot. A key recommendation for that is if you have only 1 or 2 hummingbirds visit you, they're not going to go through that nectar very quickly. So don't fill your feeder all the way up. Only fill it part of the way up. Again, they have other natural nectar sources that they're visiting during the course of a day. So, they're not completely reliant on your nectar. So you don't have to have this completely fill all the time if you don't have that many birds. And that's just going to be wasting nectar, because you're going to have to dump it every day and start over. Hummingbirds can be territorial around feeders. So if you do see a lot of them around and they seem to be sort of really fussing at each other, consider putting up a second feeder that's not in line of sight of the first feeder. And that will sort of help those territorial disputes. And if you can hang your feeder in the shade, particularly during the heat of the afternoon, if it's in the shade, that's going to help the nectar stay fresher a little bit longer, but it will start to ferment really quickly when it gets hot outside. So just keep that in mind. That can be really harmful to the birds. And it's just a matter of, like, when I change my feeder water every day, as long as it hasn't gotten moldy inside of there or something really bad hasn't happened, if for some reason I didn't pay attention to it or whatever, and I left it up longer than I should. But normally I bring my feeder in, take it apart. Literally, this just unscrews. The base here is, there's 2 pieces to that plastic base. They just come apart. I just run everything under really, really, really hot water, rinse out the glass container with really, really hot water, and fill it up with the new fresh nectar, usually about halfway, and put it back out. I don't necessarily scrub it all with soap and water every single time. Every once a week, maybe a week and a half, I will typically scrub everything down really well, just to make sure that it's staying clean. But for the most part, it's not a huge process. It's just sort of rinsing everything off, getting rid of the old nectar and putting fresh in. Orioles will come to nectar feeders as well. You can use oranges. There's typically orange feeders instead of red to attract the orioles. The ratio is a little bit different for orioles. You want to use 6 cups of water and 1 cup of sugar, but it's the same principle. Take boiled hot water, add the sugar, let it dissolve. Again, you can store it in the refrigerator. And the other thing that orioles will come to is grape jelly. Now, I know people who have had this happen. I have to say, I have never had an oriole come to either of those things. I had local orioles that would come to the tree and rip apart tent caterpillar nests and eat the caterpillars out of them. And there was grape jelly hanging in a feeder at the bottom of that tree, and they would never come down to the jelly. They only wanted the caterpillars. So again, as I had a boss that used to say, your mileage may vary. I've not had good luck attracting orioles. I know people that have. So it probably just depends on where you are, how many orioles are in your area, that kind of thing. So keep in mind when to put your feeders out in the spring. You can go online to a website called Journey North, and people enter their first of the spring hummingbird observations, and you can actually watch the hummingbird migration come up from the south. So usually when the hummingbirds start to show up, when people start to see them around Virginia or Washington, D.C., that's when I put my feeder out. And it varies a little every year, but I highly encourage you to look at that website. You can track the maps without having to make an account. But if you want to add your own observations, you can sign up for a free account and put in your first of the year observations of hummingbirds and add to that body of knowledge about hummingbird migration. They also track hummingbirds back in the fall. And you can leave your feeders up through October or November even. You won't necessarily, if it's cool, you won't necessarily have to change the nectar every day, every other day maybe. If it gets warm, go back to every day. But young hummingbirds from the West, so different species than we have here, often get sort of lost on migration. And in October and November, they end up at feeders in our area. So again, no guarantees, but if you feel so bold as to want to try to go ahead and leave your feeder out, again, making sure that it's cleaned regularly and fresh nectar is added, you might get a rarity in your backyard. So I get asked all the time what I feed. And so I finally made a slide about it just so that I had it easy. I've already talked a little bit about this, but for me, so I have about 2 feeders full of black oil sunflower seeds and 2 feeders full of split peanuts. They're all these kind of wire mesh things that are shown here. And I use these because they're super easy to clean. They are open sort of to the air, so the seed can get wet, but it also has a lot of air circulation, so it can dry. They're also not very big. So again, they're easy to hang, they're easy to move around, and they get emptied relatively quickly. So again, it's one more way of sort of trying to keep pests out of the area. And a couple of caveats, I at the moment do not take any precautions against squirrels because I just haven't had the energy to try. I typically only feed in the winter. And at the moment, I don't have to worry about deer where I am. And raccoons have never been an issue for me. I was in a place that deer were a problem. And again, I didn't really take a whole lot of precautions against them at that point either. I told you this is the feeder that my seed mix is in. And, the deer would help themselves to this, a couple of times a day, it felt like. But I never really felt like it was causing a problem in terms of the amount of food I was having to put out. So I just really didn't do a whole lot about it. I also feed a wild finch mix, which is a combination of Niger seeds, sunflower chips, and a little bit of millet. And I feed it in this feeder, the black and yellow feeder on the right. Again, this is one that it's convenient because the way this feeder is designed, birds can perch anywhere and get food out of it. And it has a tray that catches a little bit of the waste from the Niger seeds. And then, but it is open to the elements. So if it gets wet, the seed can go bad in there really quickly. It's more compacted than the tube feeders that I use for peanuts and sunflowers. So again, I just have to keep an eye on it. And if the seed gets wet, I need to dump it out and start over again. I use what's called an ultimate seed mix. A couple of different manufacturers make one that's like that. Basically, you can see there the ingredients, and I put that in either the tube feeder tube feeder like this, or in the tray. And my tray just sits on the ground. And I usually have the seed mix, some extra finch mix, some extra black oil sunflower seeds. I usually throw in some extra peanuts and then add-ins. And the add-ins are like whole peanuts, sometimes those suet nuggets, the mealworms, if I have bought any of them, that kind of thing. And then typically in the summer, I have a hummingbird feeder up, and that's pretty much the only feeder in the summer. Sometimes I'll feed the Niger seeds in the summer for the goldfinches, but that's about it. So I'm going to stop. Oh, no, wait, really quickly. Safety issues before I stop for questions. Okay. Keep it clean. I've talked about this a couple of times, but seed gets dirty, seed gets built up. There's waste products, birds poop on feeders. It's just, they're out to the elements. They get wet, they get snowed on, all of those kinds of things. really, really, really recommended that you try to clean your feeders every couple of weeks. And that's why the idea of having feeders that are really easy to clean is really important, because if it's not easy to clean, you won't clean it. Really quickly, it's the idea that you want to be able to completely dismantle that feeder easily and get into all the nooks and crannies. And so all kinds of different, I just put these on here as examples, but bottle brush cleaners that are going to help you get down inside of tube feeders that are plastic. Really, really important and critical. You can use any kind of mild dish soap that you want to use. Typically, I use hot soapy water and a bottle brush, sometimes a toothbrush, to get into certain nooks and crannies of feeders, and soap it, hot water, rinse it, let it dry, dip it into a dilute bleach solution. So it's 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. Let it soak in there for a few minutes. Let it dry, rinse it with plain water, let it dry and rinse it one more time just to make sure all the bleach is off of it, and then it's ready to go. And it sounds complicated, but it's really not that bad. And if you kind of get on a cycle, if you don't do all of your feeders at the same time, do 2 or 3 of them every other week, and kind of get in a cycle, then you get through all of your feeders and make sure that they're staying clean. Hummingbird feeders, as I mentioned, hot water, bottle brushes can be really helpful to get inside those glass containers of hummingbird feeders. Some of them are dishwasher friendly, so keep that in mind if you're buying a hummingbird feeder and you want something that's easy to clean and sort of sterilize. Maybe get a couple extra bottles that you can put in the dishwasher and sort of just change them out. I will recommend the bottle brushes, like I show here down on the bottom right, can be really helpful for those kind of feeders. What I really recommend are these tiny little port brushes. The feeding ports on hummingbird feeders are really, really small. And this is just a good way of making sure that you get really inside there and make sure there's no mold growing in there. And they usually come in a 3 or a 5 pack, and they're sold pretty much any place you buy hummingbird feeders, bird seed, that kind of situation. The 2 sets of tools here in the middle, we talked about bird baths before, and this is the idea of you need to scrub out your bird bath on a regular basis. And in the summer, when the birds are using it frequently, you might have to do it every day. You don't have to thoroughly clean it with soap and all of that kind of stuff. But the idea of having a scrub brush like this that you can go out with your hose or your watering can and scrub any debris that's in the bottom, make sure that there's no mold growing in it or anything like that, rinse it out well with fresh water, and then fill it back up, is going to keep those birds in tip-top shape. And it's also going to make sure that your bird bath does not become a mosquito breeding factory, because if you're cleaning it out regularly and dumping it out and adding fresh water, you will be disrupting the breeding cycle of the mosquitoes. The rake is here to remind you that if you do not use no waste seed mixes, you will need to rake up underneath your feeders and get rid of that waste seed shells and all of that kind of stuff. You can throw it in the trash. If you have a compost heap, you can throw it in the compost heap. And I often recommend that you keep a bag of mulch around, because you may want to sort of, remulch that area. You're going to rake that up when you rake up the seeds again, but it's a way of also just sort of helping clean that area up. Typically the area under bird feeders, because of the seeds and because of the activity of birds, is not going to have a lot of grass growing. So if you have a way that you can, make a permanent feeder where you don't care that the grass grows and it's easy to clean up the bottom, that's great. Otherwise, think about, are there elements of your yard that you can move and rotate through areas so that you're not continually beating down that one area of your grass, if that matters to you. And window collisions. So window collisions are a challenge. 1 billion or more birds a year are killed by hitting windows. And I'm going to give you the quickest top level introduction to this. Next Wednesday, there is a much more in-depth webinar. Wissahickon Trails staff member Margaret Rohde is part of that presentation, and it's a joint presentation with Audubon and a whole bunch of other local bird partners. And there's information on our website that you can go sign up for it. It's free, and that will go much more in depth. But basically, what it comes down to is transparent glass is invisible, and it's invisible to us as well as birds. But as humans, most of the time, we can use contexts like door frames and other visual clues to let us know that there is a transparent piece of glass there and we shouldn't walk into it. Sometimes when we don't have the proper context, even as humans, we actually do walk into glass. So we need that context, but birds don't live in our world. We live in their world, and they don't understand our context. So when they see this window, they see one of two things. They either see the reflection of their environment in that window, like you see here. So they think, hey, there's a tree I can go land in. And so they fly into the window. Or in places where there's, two windows that you can see through all the way through, they actually will see all the way through to the trees on the other side. So again, it's a huge issue and something that we should really try to protect the birds as much as we can if we're going to have feeders in our backyard. Screens on your window help a little bit just because they add a little bit of a cushion from the birds hitting the window, but they are not a fail-safe solution. Blinds on the inside of your window can help, but at certain times of the day, even with blinds on your window, there's going to be a reflection on that glass that looks like, the environment outside. And that's just going to depend on the angle of the sun and how it moves around your house. These kind of falcony, hawk-like stickers that people said, oh, put one up in your window and it acts like a predator and it keeps the birds away, they don't work. They don't keep the birds away from the window. They're not enough of a deterrent to prevent the birds from flying in. And it's almost like the birds know that it's not really a hawk and it's not really a predator. And so that kind of approach isn't going to help. From a feeder perspective, the recommendations are your feeder should either be 3 feet from your windows or more than 30 feet from your windows. And I know that sounds really weird, but the 3 feet from your windows, if a bird is trying to escape a predator like a hawk or a cat or something, or whatever, and it tries to fly, if it's only going 3 feet and it hits your window, it's probably not going at full speed. So it's much less likely to be seriously injured. That's not a guarantee, but it's, generally speaking. So the more than 30 feet away is because then that gives them much broader avenues of escape without coming near your house or potentially hitting your windows. And there's just more places for them to go further away when they are up at full speed, from trying to escape from a predator. Excuse me. The reality is that windows are a problem no matter how far away from your feeders they are. And so really seriously think about looking into this a little bit more. Again, as I said, I'm doing a very top level because of this other program. There are a number of different mechanisms that you can use. So I'm going to start up here in the top left. These kinds of tape patterns, diagonal, horizontal, they can work. Talk about the recommendations for the spacing in a second. You can buy strips of these tiny little dots that are stickers that you put on your windows. A lot of these need to be put on the outside of your window to be the most effective, but there are a few that can go inside that will help. They are designed so that they reflect UV light, so they are more apparent to birds than they are to us. They are designed to, these pictures are shown in great detail purposefully to show people what they look like on the windows. When you actually look through your windows, they don't quite look this intense. So if you're worried about, blocking your view or things like that, they are designed to allow for us to see out of the windows fairly well and, prevent the birds from hitting the window. So those are both sort of sticker approaches, kind of different patterns that you can do. There's another set of a system that you can buy that are actually strings that you can make these yourself. You can hang a frame up on the top of your window and hang strings down like this, and this vertical spacing again shows the bird that there's something there. And basically that vertical spacing is too narrow for most birds to fly through, so they will avoid that space. And that's exactly the same with these lines and the dots. The space between them is too small for the bird to fly through, so it knows something's there and it will avoid that space. If you're feeling very creative, there are paints that you can get that you can actually paint designs on your window like this. And again, you want to make sure you don't have very large spaces in between things. You want small spaces so that the birds think there's not enough room for them to get through, and they'll avoid your window. And these can be, some of these paints can easily be washed off and repainted, so you can do different designs. Kids love this kind of idea, and there's lots of things that you can do there. So again, lots of different options. If you can't make the website next week, I'm pretty sure they're recording it, but I'm not positive. But encourage you to sign up for it if you can. And then for more information on this, go to the American Bird Conservancy's website, and they have the most comprehensive information about the systems that you can get. If you're replacing your windows in your house or building a new house, seriously think about buying bird safe glass. A lot of it has come way down in price, and the UV reflectiveness is built into the glass, so you don't have to do any of these kinds of things on the outside of your windows. So again, lots of different options, but something to really keep in mind if you're trying to make your yard more bird friendly and having bird feeders there. So I'm going to stop here for questions. I know I saw a bunch of stuff come up here. So oh, I didn't answer this before. Somebody asked, is a pond a good water source? And it can be. What it kind of depends on, if you have an area of that pond where the water is shallower, and typically, so my dad has a pond in his backyard, for example, and I know that he has a waterfall in his, and there's two shelves of that waterfall, the way he built it, that the water splashes on and provides a really shallow bathing area, and the birds love those places. So if you have areas that have sort of a rocky edge and are very shallow and have a way for birds to get into shallow water, then yes, a pond can be a very good source for birds. A lot of backyard ponds don't have that gradual incline into the pond like natural ponds do. They tend to be, especially when we use preformed liners, they're much more structured and go right into 2 feet down, and that's too deep for most birds to use. They may come and get a drink out of the edge, but they won't use it for bathing. They really need that shallow area. So if you have a pond and it doesn't have that shallow area, think of if there's a way that you can add that, and then you'd have a great water source, because the idea of a pond is it's keeping itself clean. You're probably filtering it, that'd be great. Somebody asks, does a bird feeder attract mice? It can. And that's also one of the reasons why keeping the ground underneath of it clean can be really, really helpful to help deter mice. But yes, it can attract mice for sure. And like I said earlier, you put food out for the birds, you're basically putting food out for everybody in the neighborhood. You might attract skunks too. So you just, yeah, if it's there, they will come. And again, just the idea of keeping things clean. A lot of the protections that you can take for squirrels will help reduce issues with mice and raccoons and chipmunks and all of those kinds of things as well. So again, keep it clean, keep it protected, and that's the best that you can do. Somebody says, aren't the shells of sunflowers not good for plants growing underneath the feeders? Yes. I have never had good luck of having anything grow under the feeders between the amount of seed shells that fall and then the birds that are ground feeders, like a lot of our sparrows, so the white-throated sparrows and the juncos, dark-eyed juncos that are here now for the winter, they scratch feed. And so they're sorting through that stuff that's fallen onto the ground. And while they're doing that, they're also moving any mulch, any leaf litter, any pieces of plants that get in their way. And so typically I've given up trying to grow anything right underneath my feeders because it doesn't grow. And again, that's a good reason to make sure that you clean all that old shells out of there as well, because then it forces the birds to sort of go look someplace else for that ground food and not right under your feeders. Somebody commented in the breeding season, saving eggshells. Yes, you can do that. You can wash them, water, bake them, crush them up, and add them to mixed seed to help give the calcium back to the birds. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's loads of recommendations online for how to do that. I tend to make my own suet, actually. I don't usually buy the stuff that's already made. I make a recipe that I buy rendered suet in a tub in the grocery store and add peanut butter and some flour and some cornmeal and a little bit of sugar and sometimes some extra peanuts and sometimes some mealworms and make my own suet. I find it to be more cost effective. So there are a couple of things like that. And if you're interested in more information, let me know. So much to cover in this tonight that I sort of left a lot of those little kinds of things out. But I can certainly point you in the direction of resources for those kinds of things if that's something that you're interested in doing. Somebody asked, are the pine siskins due to eruptions like the red-bellied nuthatches? Absolutely. We have 3 eruptions going on right now. Pine siskins, red-breasted nuthatches, sorry, and evening grosbeaks are actually erupting right now into our area. I'm going to talk about them in just a second, but yes, they're all eruptive species. So the food source up north has been is not sufficient for whatever reason, and they're wandering in giant flocks down into our area. So yeah, I have had red-breasted nuthatches in my yard already this year, and I had a flock of pine siskins for most of the month of September and October. They're gone now. I haven't seen them much around, but I need to put my feeders out. So if they're still in the area, they may come back to the Niger seed when I get it out. Somebody asked, will cardinals eat the non-waste seed? I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Cardinals, so I'm not sure what you mean by that. So if you can clarify that one a little bit, I can come back to that. Had a catbird eat a quarter of an orange every day? Yes, I've had catbirds when they come back in the spring. You know, they go to the oranges and they love it. Once they get into the breeding season, I tend not to see them as much on the fruit, but they do like oranges for sure, which actually kind of makes sense. We tend not to think about this, but a lot of those birds spend their winters in the tropics, where, you know, there's oranges growing on trees all the time, and there's bananas available, and mangoes and papayas, and those birds, a lot of birds will eat those. It doesn't become a major food source for them up here, but oftentimes, especially in the spring, as migrants are coming back, you can attract different species to your yard by putting out, especially that fruit kind of thing. Hawks have to eat too. Yes, they do. Yeah, you can yell at them. That's true. If you say, you know, they can be one tactic for trying to get them to stay away. A red tail, yes, red tails will hang around your yard. Typically, they don't go after birds, they go after squirrels, and red-shouldered hawks as well. They often go after squirrels also. They can go after birds more than red-tailed hawks do, but the red shoulders often will go after squirrels as well. So if you see those guys, you know, cheer for them, because, you know, then the less squirrels that'll be on your feeder. Yeah, slinkies on poles can help with the squirrels. Again, they just, you know, it depends on how determined they are. Somebody else says the squirrels are laughing at their slinky. So yeah, that's pretty much what happens. Hummingbirds' best time of the year is the summertime. They usually come back here late April, early May-ish. And most of them are gone by the end of September. There's often a few, hanging around. But for the most part, yeah, the summertime is the best time. And I will warn you guys, so if you have a feeder, a hummingbird feeder, and you've got hummingbirds in the spring and you think everything's going really good and you've had hummingbirds regularly, and then all of a sudden you have no hummingbirds. You're like, where'd they all go? And it's like June. It's totally normal. When the non-native honeysuckle is blooming, those little yellow and white flowers, that is like crack to these birds, and they will abandon all of your hummingbird feeders that you so painstakingly keep clean and put fresh nectar in for them, and go eat the nectar of the honeysuckle bushes. And when those honeysuckle bushes are done blooming, they'll come back to your feeder. So it's not unusual for, around the beginning, in the middle of the summer, when those bushes are blooming, for the hummingbirds to completely disappear from your yard. Don't panic, they'll be back. Somebody asked, do the starlings and house sparrows eat my peanuts? Yes, they do. I haven't had too much of an issue where I am with too many starlings. I have a couple. Weirdly, I don't seem to have a huge flock of them invading my feeders. And house sparrows, the house sparrows usually, so one tactic that I take, and I didn't say this before, for house sparrows and sometimes for the squirrels, what I will do is I will take a scoop of like the grain mix and put it somewhere else on the ground, away from where my main feeders are. And oftentimes the house sparrows will go there. Like I have a couple shrubs that I really don't care about. So I don't care if the sparrows, they're in my yard, they're not native, they need to come out, and I just haven't gotten them out yet. So I will throw seed under there, and the sparrows will do their thing on the ground and kind of, make stuff not grow, but it doesn't really bother me. And that kind of helps keep them away from my feeder areas. But yes, they're pretty much going to eat everything. Mostly the house sparrows like to eat on the ground, so they're not too much of a problem when I have the peanuts up in the feeder. They prefer more ground things, or platform feeders. Somebody asked about keeping the bird feeders out all year. I think I answered that. Mostly I only feed in the winter, so from like now until the spring, for the most part. Somebody asked if banana peels thrown under the trees attract any birds. I have no idea. I've never tried that. The only birds I've ever seen eat bananas are tropical birds, and they actually eat the banana and peel the peel off of it, just like we do. They just don't eat the peel. Okay, last real quick, 2 citizen science projects that you can do from the comfort of your own backyard. One is Project Feeder Watch, and one is the Great Backyard Bird Count. Project Feeder Watch is a massive effort that has been going on since the winter of 1987-88 in its current format. It actually started up in Ontario in 1976. And basically, this is a winter-long survey of the birds that visit feeders in backyards, or nature centers or community centers, other things like that, where people might have feeders set up that somebody can observe them. To date, there's more than 20,000 participants of this program and contributing data to this program. And it has, because of the amount of data that it collects every year, it is a really proven tool for monitoring distribution and abundance of winter bird populations. There have been a number of publications that have been released on long-term trends in bird distribution and abundance in the winter. The timing and extent of those winter eruptions of birds like the red-breasted nuthatch or the pine siskin can be documented, although oddly enough, both of those eruptions this year started well before Project Feeder Watch would have kicked off, because Project Feeder Watch starts next week, I think. I have the date on the next slide. It hasn't started yet. So the eruptions of the pine siskins happened a month and a half ago, and the red-breasted nuthatches have been showing up since the end of August, actually. But again, in general, this is a really good tool for doing that. It's shown over time, expansions and contractions in the winter range of birds. And because of the information that you give them about the types of feeders that you're using, the numbers of feeders that you're using, and the kind of food that you're feeding, it talks about food and environmental factors that attract your birds. So it also asks you questions when you register a site about your yard and the area around you. And it's actually a good point, and I forgot to mention it when I was talking about the plants in your yard and making things bird friendly. You don't have to do all that yourself. So think about what's in your neighbor's yard. And if you're friends with your neighbors, so much the better, because then you can combine efforts to plant things that are going to be beneficial for the birds and other wildlife. So if they already have a stand of evergreen trees, you probably don't need to add more evergreen trees to your yard. But if nobody has an oak tree, then maybe you can plant an oak tree. So those kinds of things, think about the larger area around you and what's missing, and start improving your yard based on that, rather than feeling like you have to do it all in your own backyard, because you don't. The birds don't care. The birds, will fly to your neighbor's yard and roost in their pine trees, and that's perfectly acceptable if they're there. So keep that in mind. And it's the same with Project Feeder Watch. They'll ask you if there's any other feeders in the close vicinity, and they'll ask you in the vicinity of your feeders, like what's around. And even if it's not in your yard, you can make that part of the habitat, because the birds will be using it. So it's a really cool study. So I mentioned that evening grosbeaks are erupting now as well. And this is one that really excites me, because in 25 years of birding, I have never seen this bird. And I am dying for this bird to come to my backyard and eat my sunflowers. They eat sunflowers like crazy. And if a flock of evening grosbeaks lands in your backyard, you may have no sunflowers left. They like tray feeders. So if you want to try to attract them, a tray feeder, black oil sunflower seeds, and they'll be happy. I can't guarantee they're going to come, but there are a number of them in the area. They keep being reported all over Montgomery and Bucks County, in Philadelphia even. So yeah, this is a good year for them. And it hasn't been a good year for them to come here in a long, long time. And it's one of the things that the Project Feeder Watch has shown. So you can go online to Project Feeder Watch's site and run sort of these graphic map analysis for all different kinds of species of birds that comes to feeders. So I had chosen the evening grosbeak as my example. And the reason why is because, so there's a couple of things being shown here. On the left, this is 1990, first of all. So this is several years ago at this point. And the map on the left shows the percent of the feeders that were visited of the total Feeder Watch locations. So if we just concentrate right here on the Northeast right now, 28.1% of the feeders in Project Feeder Watch had evening grosbeaks come to them at least once in their Project Feeder Watch cycle. The average flock size that was present in the Northeast was 15.7 birds. So let's 16 birds, excuse me, on average. Last year, in 2019, in the Northeast, only 9.6% of the feeders visited had evening grosbeaks visit them. And the average flock size went down to 13.9 birds, 14 birds. So couple of things going on here. And this has been, and if you actually run the graphic online, you can see the declines across all of the other regions as well. In the Pacific Northwest, 50% of the feeders had grosbeaks in 1990. Only 7% had them last year. In the middle of the country, 16.2% down to 3.5%. Even down here, what we think of as the desert, these birds wander in the winter though, 21% had them, only 6.3% last year had them. And in general, the flock sizes are going down too. The one place that they're not going down is up north. In 1990, there were none at the Feeder Watch's sites up there. Now 1.6%, still very small, but they're being seen there with a flock size of about 7 birds. So a couple of things are going on here, and we're not going to spend a ton of time understanding why grosbeaks are declining, but this is the kind of data that Project Feeder Watch has been very valuable in collecting and having citizen scientists in their backyard contributing to. So we now understand that there was a theory that more birds were staying north because more people were feeding birds. And so they just weren't coming as far south, and we were not seeing them as frequently. And if you break out these numbers, it may be true that the northern part of this region has more than the southern part of the region, but overall, it seems like the bigger driver of this, again, because the flock sizes are diminishing everywhere, and just the significant reduction in places like the Pacific Northwest from 50% down to 7%, the population of the evening grosbeaks is probably significantly declining. And so that means that we need to do more things to be protecting their breeding habitat and the places that they do spend the winter when they don't come down here, so that we keep that population level. And there's probably a lot of reasons why that population is declining, but this is the kind of thing that the Project Feeder Watch data can help us tease out. In contrast, since we were talking about Cooper's hawks earlier and the fact that they will stake out your feeders, Cooper's hawks have expanded their ranges. And these are the northeast numbers, because the one that's most relevant to us. But in 1990, only 7.2% of feeder watches had a Cooper's hawk visit their feeders during the course of a winter. In 2019, 32% of them had a Cooper's hawk. So there's probably more Cooper's hawks than there used to be, and they're in more places than they used to be as well. So they're expanding. But again, the takeaway from this is there's a lot of really cool data that can be teased out of here. There's a lot of data that you can go look at if you're interested on the Project Feeder Watch website. This is just one example, but keep your eyes out for evening grosbeaks. And if you have one, email me, because I'm coming to your yard because I want to see this bird. So Project Feeder Watch runs from November 14th to the 20th. All of the information that you need to participate in this project is on the Project Feeder Watch website. But in short, you're counting all the birds that come to your feeders on 2 consecutive days. You decide what days. Usually, if you're only really at home on Saturdays and Sundays, then that's when you would count. Now, since a lot of us are working from home, maybe we can count on Wednesdays and Thursdays. I don't know. And you don't have to count all day. You estimate the time that you counted. You can count for 15 minutes, and that's fine. They do ask you to try to be somewhat consistent about the amount of times, but you're going to have days when you can count more and days when you can count less, and that's okay. It takes that into account, and it is okay to skip some time. If you're going away, you run out of bird seed, whatever, it's fine. It's not going to impact the data. But basically you're just writing down the birds and the peak number of that species that you see at your feeders at any one point in time. And again, this is a very simplistic explanation. Everything you need to know is on Feeder Watch. And if you haven't done it before, I highly recommend doing it. I think it's really fun. This is how I got involved in citizen science way back when, and I've been doing it for a long time. And it's a lot of fun to keep track of it and see how things change over the years. I haven't been as consistent since I've been in this house as I was before, so I don't have like the history data yet, but I need to get back into it and do it. So, and it's great if you have kids, because there's a lot of information on the Project Feeder Watch site about bird identification, and most of the birds that come to our feeders, there's probably about a dozen key ones that you need to learn, and they're relatively easy to identify, so that can be really fun for kids to learn as well. The other one is the Great Backyard Bird Count, and you can do this in addition to Project Feeder Watch, or if Project Feeder Watch isn't, you know, if you don't want to commit to something that long over the whole winter, this is one weekend in February. And although it says Great Backyard Bird Count, you can actually count birds anywhere. So you can do it from your backyard. But if you wanted to go to one of the Wissahickon Trails preserves and count the birds on that preserve, you can do that as well. Basically, you enter all your data into eBird, create a free account, and create those lists in eBird and put your bird counts in. And globally, this is the 2019 statistics here. You can see we counted, what, 27 million birds in a weekend. It's pretty cool. Yes, it's very North America focused, but they're really trying to get it to go global at this point. Excuse me, it really started as a backyard bird count in North America, and now they've kind of expanded it so you don't have to stay in your own backyard, and you know, roll it out across the world. So again, there's a website for this. Just search Great Backyard Bird Count and it'll come up. All these projects are a joint effort of Audubon and the Cornell and Bird Studies Canada. And so usually Cornell's the one running the website, but they're really a combined effort of all these organizations to better understand birds and how they're moving and how they're using our environment, and, you know, trying to get some measure of population status for a lot of these species. So I'm going to stop here, take one last round of questions. Two upcoming events, as I mentioned, next Wednesday is the Audubon Window Collisions program. And on the 19th is All About Owls that I'm doing, just like this. Registration for both of those programs is on our website. So you can go to our events tab and find the free registration links for those programs if you're interested. Also on our website, in the Take Action at Home tab at the top, you can look in there, and there's information on native plant and birdseed sales. So where you can find native plants locally, who typically has sales, roughly when they have them, and then some local birdseed sources, both sales that happen. They may not be happening this year as much, but there is a Wild Birds Unlimited store in Dresher that is run by somebody who's very active in the local Wyncote Audubon Society. He's been a longtime supporter of the Wissahickon Trails Birdathon in the spring. And so I like to encourage people, if you're going to go buy feeders, go buy seed, go check out his store in Dresher. And he is open, and, you know, take proper precautions, wear a mask, but go give him your business if you can and you're local enough to, you know, need some seed or need some new feeders, because I'm sure he would really appreciate that. So double check and see if there's any questions here. There we go. Somebody says, anyone staying at home due to COVID-19, Moyer in Souderton has delivery of great bird seed. Good point. Yes, for some people, delivery is the best option at this point in time. So certainly good to know. If there are no other questions, I'm going to end it here. And I thank you very much for joining us this evening. And hopefully you were able to take something away, hopefully some tips and tricks about maybe keeping squirrels away from your feeders, or just some ideas of how you can improve your you know, feeding stations and overall backyard habitat to benefit the birds. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.